The hands that spoke Amara Thompson moved like quiet water through the bright gold of Luron's dining room. Her white server's jacket pressed smooth, her name tag reflecting the chandelier light, her steps careful on the marble floor that made every footfall ring a little louder than she liked. And even while the dining room buzzed with money and perfume and hushed business, she kept her eyes low and her mind steady, telling herself to breathe, to smile, to serve, and to go home to Marcus with enough energy left to ask about his classes and to heat the soup she had made before her shift. Because routines were how she held her life together, routines and love and the memory of the woman who had raised them. Her grandmother, who used to say that silence is not empty, it is a room full of details. You only need to learn how to look. And those words lived in Amara's hands as much as in her heart, because her hands had learned a language that did not need sound to be bright, a language that her shy face rarely advertised, a language she kept like a secret kindness for the day it would matter, though she did not know it would be today, not until Gerald, the floor manager with the permanently pinched mouth, touched her elbow and said, "Table 12 VIP, and please, Thompson, be perfect." When Amara turned toward table 12, she saw first the son, Edward Hale, a name the city tossed around with equal doses of praise and caution, a hard-edged charm in a dark suit cut close, a phone always near, eyes that measured people like balance sheets. And across from him sat his mother, Margaret, elegant silver hair pinned in a calm knot, pearl earrings like small moons, spine straight, hands quiet on a clutch that looked older than fashion and more honest than trend. And when Amara drew near, she saw the tiny hearing aids tucked behind Margaret's ears. She noticed how Margaret's eyes rested on Amara's lips, counting words as shapes, and she saw the quick flinch in the mother's shoulders when Edward said without looking up, "Bring the real wine list and speak up." And he added in a lower tone not meant to hold kindness, "Don't bother addressing her, she won't hear you anyway." And the cold of those words moved through Amara like a draft under a door. But another current moved faster, the one her grandmother had taught her, the one that said dignity is a right, not a luxury. And before she could second-guess herself, before the old habit of being invisible dragged her back, Amara stepped into Margaret's direct gaze, let her breath settle into her ribs, raised her hands, and signed with the fluid grace of memory. "Good evening, Mrs. Hale. Welcome to Luron. My name is Amara. I am honored to serve you tonight." Everything changed in an instant because joy is quick. It is the fastest light in any room, and it lit Margaret's face first, widening her eyes, softening her mouth into a smile that seemed to loosen years from her posture, and her hands rose too, elegant and certain. "You sign, how wonderful. It is rare in a place like this." And Amara, shy but steady now, added with her voice and her hands together so that both mother and son could follow, "Would you like tonight's specials? Our chef has prepared subtle dishes that are easy to enjoy while we talk." And while she signed, Edward's attention sharpened. The casual impatience curdled into suspicion. The fork paused in his fingers. The tapping stopped, and he said in a tone that made nearby tables glance over, "What are you doing?" And Amara said quietly, "I am greeting your mother, sir." And Margaret touched Amara's wrist, a gentle thank you that carried more warmth than the tall candles on the table, and she signed again. "Your movements are beautiful. Where did you learn?" And Amara told her, "My grandmother was deaf. She raised my brother and me. She said sign language is dancing with your hands. Let it flow like water," and Margaret laughed, a soft sound she did not often share in public, and the room around them, so used to polished performance, felt for a moment like an honest place. But honesty can pull the mask from other things too. And from the edge of the room, a man in a gray suit, alone with a coffee he didn't drink, lowered a folded newspaper and watched them with the calm attention of someone who comes to a place, not for food, but for information, his eyes sliding from Amara's hands to Edward's face and back again. And when Amara noticed him noticing them, a cold prickle moved along her arms, the same warning she used to feel crossing certain corners in their old neighborhood, and she kept her face smooth for the table. And she signed to Margaret, "Would you like me to choose the appetizers?" And Margaret signed, "Yes, please." "I trust your taste," and she added privately, without moving her head, "Someone has followed us for days. You are right to be careful." And Amara understood that kindness and danger sometimes arrive at the same time, and she stepped away to place their order, steadying her breath, counting steps, promising herself to stay present and calm and useful, because usefulness was the shield she knew best. When she returned with a tray of small plates chosen for grace rather than fuss, she found the dynamic already shifting. Because power does not like to be surprised, and Edward had been surprised twice. first by his mother's happiness and then by his own lack of control over it, and he said to Amara in a voice wrapped in politeness but tightened at the edges, "What are the odds that our server tonight happens to sign like that? And in my world, coincidences are rarely innocent." And Margaret's hands moved fast and sharp. "Edward James Hale, you will not interrogate this young woman like she is a rival CEO." And Amara, careful to keep her posture respectful, said gently, "I have worked here 2 years. Sir, you can ask my manager. I learned to sign when I was 4. My grandmother lost her hearing in a factory accident. She taught me to see people, not just serve them." And the mother smiled again as if the words washed something heavy from her chest. But the son's jaw tightened. And in that tension, a second figure entered. Victor Hale, the cousin with a warm grin that didn't reach his eyes, invited by a text the way storms are invited by heat, and his greetings blurred into small talk laced with family currents. The gray suit man moved one table closer, and the air around table 12 changed from elegant to electric, and in the humming noise of cutlery and jazz and judged etiquette, Amara felt a line she could not see but could feel. A line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed, and without choosing to, she stepped over it by staying, by signing, by refusing invisibility. Before the main course, a clumsy collision staged as an accident rattled their table, a different server's elbow catching Amara's arm, water fanning across linen. Embarrassment offered like a spectacle, but Margaret cut the performance with a single steady sentence. "This young woman will handle our table alone," and the other server retreated with heat in her cheeks. And that was the moment when Amara understood that Margaret was not fragile. She was forged. And that forged people tend to draw fire from those who profit when others feel small. And so the plates were cleared, and recommendations were made, and conversation threaded between voice and hand and gaze, and underneath all of it, like a bass note you felt more than heard, a question hummed, "How far does one act of respect travel? And what does it reveal when it moves through rooms built to hide certain truths?" And in that question, Amara found both fear and purpose. Because fear tells you where the edges are, and purpose tells you why you should cross them anyway. When her shift finally ended long after midnight, when the last espresso cup clinked into the bin and the last folded napkin slotted into the drawer, Amara walked home through cool air that smelled faintly of rain. And inside the small apartment that love had made warm no matter the season, Marcus looked up from his textbook, saw the story in his sister's face before she told it, and listened as she described the mother who came alive at the sight of signing hands, the son who bristled when he could not control the terms of connection, the cousin with the smile like polished steel, and the gray suit watcher who made the skin between Amara's shoulders tighten. And when she finished, Marcus said quietly, "Be careful, Mara. Sometimes the first good thing that happens in a room is also the first thing certain people try to break." And she nodded, and she thought of her grandmother's hands, steady even on the worst days, and she promised herself that if a storm was coming, she would not let kindness be the first thing it took. The eyes in the dining room. The next evening, Luron was booked solid. The kind of night that made Gerald count steps and whisper reminders into the earpieces of hosts. But Amara felt a different rhythm in her chest. Not dread, not exactly. More like the hum a violin string holds after a bow lifts. A soft vibration of unfinished music. And when she checked the reservations board and saw the Hale name again beside table 12, she felt both a small lift and a keener edge, because good connections carry responsibility, and responsibility is heavier when danger shadows it. And she told herself to move with care, to listen with her eyes, and to trust the instincts her life had taught her to honor. Instincts that had saved her and Marcus more than once. When the Hales arrived, the change was visible even to staff who did not know language beyond smiles, because Margaret entered with her chin higher, her eyes bright, and when she saw Amara she lifted her hands in greeting, elegant signs that said "good to see you," and Amara replied with warmth that reached beyond professionalism, "Welcome back, I saved your favorite seat." And Edward watched the exchange with that same knife-thin patience. And Victor trailed behind with a conspirator's brightness that made friendly words sound like rehearsed lines. And as coats were taken and chairs slid in and water poured, the gray suit watcher reappeared at the window table. The same empty coffee ordered, the same newspaper unfolded, and Amara placed him now not by name but by type. The kind of man who takes up space without claiming it, who observes without declaring motive, who is paid to be a camera with legs. Amara took orders with her voice and hands, translating Margaret's preferences into dishes and Edward's preferences into control. easing friction with small, unremarkable kindnesses like timing and eye contact and the right dessert question, and she felt gratitude for skills people call soft because they are hard to measure, yet they are the exact skills that hold rooms together. And while she moved like this, a small coincidence slid into her path, the kind that is not a coincidence at all. A man in a tailored navy suit with the quiet swagger of corporate counsel approached the Hale table, bowed to Margaret, traded cool nods with Edward and Victor, and sat briefly, sliding a slim envelope onto the linen, the envelope left unopened as if to say, "We are too sophisticated to be seen eager." And when he left, Amara saw printed on the envelope's corner the name of a venture partner firm she recognized from business headlines. A firm recently tied to a scandal about data ethics, the kind where user privacy had been treated like loose change. And she did not stare, she did not linger. She carried plates and refilled glasses. But the detail pinned itself in her mind like a note under a magnet. Later, while presenting a delicate main course, Amara saw Margaret's hand tremble for the first time. Not with weakness, but with contained anger. And she signed to Amara while speaking softly, "I will need an interpreter tomorrow, just for a family meeting. No publicity, no boardroom theater. I would feel safer if you were there." And Amara's heart skipped because this was beyond service, this was trust. And trust, once given, adds a duty to be clear. So she signed back with calm precision. "I can help, but only if it is appropriate. I am a server, not a professional interpreter." And Margaret's smile did not waver. "You are a communicator, that is rarer." And she said aloud for Edward's benefit, "I would like Amara present tomorrow morning." And Edward, who had been pretending indifference, snapped his attention to the conversation, and for a breath they all sat in the echo of the ask, until Victor said with smooth brightness, "That could be charming." A human touch for a difficult topic, and Edward's eyes flicked to Victor's face as if to ask silently whose chess move this truly was. And he finally said, "If it pleases you, Mother, fine." The meeting was set for the next morning in a private lounge above the restaurant that Luron rented for exclusive breakfasts, an arrangement used by people who valued discretion as currency. And when Amara arrived early, she found the space already prepared with coffee and fruit and a small whiteboard, and she stood by the window letting her breath even out, reminding herself that she was here because she could make a conversation possible. Not because she wanted to be in anyone's story. And yet stories have a way of choosing their witnesses, and she was already chosen. And when the Hale trio arrived, Margaret crisp in dove gray, Edward in navy with his phone holstered but not silent, Victor in a lighter suit with laughter in his mouth and calculation in his eyes, the tension crackled like static, and they got to work. Margaret began with her hands calm but firm. "I will not approve the Singapore expansion as drafted." And she glanced at Amara, who voiced the message with respectful clarity, and Margaret continued, "The partner you chose has unresolved ethics issues. There are pending inquiries about how they treat consent in data collection, and if you drag our company into that mud, you will soil our name and our future." And Amara carried each idea into the air where Edward could not pretend to miss it, shaping Margaret's precision into simple sentences. And Edward, to his credit, argued substance, market share and speed and competitive pressure, and Victor added color, promising influence and favorable articles and a new class of client. But when pressed for details, Victor's certainty slipped just a fraction, the way a mask slips when someone bumps it, and Margaret, who had mothered a son and survived a marriage to a man who worshipped perfection, saw the slip and pressed harder, and asked to see the vendor list and the due diligence notes. And Victor spoke a shade too quickly. "The papers are in order." And Amara felt the wrongness in the seam of that sentence like a snag on silk. Before they could continue, the gray suit man entered the lounge with a tray and a pretext. He had borrowed a server's jacket. He carried coffee. He smiled with the neutral warmth of hospitality, and anyone else might have accepted him as part of the room. But Amara knew the entire real staff, and this man was not one of them, so she moved gently to intercept. "I can take that, thank you," and the man hesitated, assessing the small woman who stood somehow exactly where he needed to walk, and he handed over the tray with a fraction of reluctance. And in that moment Amara saw the cufflink on his sleeve, a discreet logo she had seen on the envelope last night, and the shape of the game sharpened. Someone wanted to listen, to move information, to guide a decision not with truth but with pressure, and she set the tray down, smiled like a professional, and made a tiny signal with her eyes to Margaret. A warning without panic, and Margaret adjusted, switching to signs without voicing. and they continued the most important questions in a language the interloper could not follow, unless he had prepared more than a jacket. And the man left, and the meeting ended without a resolution, only a new clarity about where the fight would live. Afterward, as Amara walked downstairs to start her regular shift, Gerald caught her by the service elevator, his voice low with something that sounded almost like concern. "Thompson, you're in deeper waters than your job description. Be smart, keep your head." And she nodded, grateful for once that the man who measured table turns like oxygen could still recognize a human line. And she passed through the kitchen where steam and garlic and heat felt suddenly like a kind of refuge. And she told herself again, "You are not a heroine, you are a helper." And then she smiled at the truth her grandmother would have signed. Sometimes the helper is the only one who can open the right door. The contract of silence news did not break, not yet, because powerful families manage stories the way orchestras manage sound, letting only certain notes reach the audience. But inside the circle the pressure rose, and when pressure rises, cracks appear where no one expects them, and one such crack opened in a quiet place, the staff entrance corridor where deliveries stacked and schedules were taped, because that was where Chloe, smarting from last night's humiliation, her pride stung and her ambition bruised, cornered Amara with a question that sounded like a threat. "What are you doing with them?" Thompson and Amara said calmly, "I am doing my job," and Chloe stepped closer, her eyes hard. "Jobs like ours don't include private meetings with the rich, unless someone is auditioning for a fairy tale." And Amara held her ground with a gentleness that sometimes disarms better than force. "There is no fairy tale, Chloe. I'm interpreting so the mother can be heard in her own way. That is all." And Chloe laughed a small, sharp laugh. "You think that's all? You are in a game you can't see. And when people like that get tired of a piece, they sweep it off the board." And for just a second, pity washed through Amara. Pity for the way harshness protects the wounded, and she said softly, "I'll be careful." And Chloe looked away first, muttering, "You should be." That afternoon, Margaret returned alone, a simple blouse, a notebook in her bag, eyes that said tired but unbroken. And she asked if she could sit in the small corner near the service door where she could watch the room without being watched. And Gerald, who understood exactly how many dollars an elegant, loyal patron represents, agreed with unusual speed. And Amara brought tea in a small plate, and they signed without fuss. And Margaret asked about Marcus, about his classes, about the way young engineers dream of building bridges that make life fairer for people who walk, not just for the cars that drive. And Amara felt seen in a way that usually belonged to family alone. And she returned the seeing, asking how it felt to be brilliant in a world that treats the inability to hear as the inability to contribute. And Margaret answered with a rueful grace, "The world is noisy with opinions about what makes a person whole. Sometimes silence is the only way to hear yourself." They spoke also of the contract, for everything important becomes a contract at some point, a promise, a line, a choice. And Margaret signed her belief that companies must treat data like borrowed trust, not like property taken. And she worried that Victor had carved private pathways through the vendor maze, side agreements that enriched a few and endangered many. And Amara said, "I am not a lawyer, but I understand consent. It is the center of every language, even the silent ones." And Margaret's eyes shone with a mixture of pride and sadness, because she had raised a son who understood power before he understood dignity, and that order is hard to reverse. The turning point came not with a dramatic reveal, but with a brown envelope that should have gone to the back office but landed at the hostess stand, where Jessica, kind and meticulous, marked it for management, only to have it slip off the stack and onto the floor at Amara's feet when she passed. And life is often a chain of small accidents that add up to fate. And the envelope was unsealed, and the top document was a catering invoice for a private off-site strategy dinner, hosted by the venture partner firm at a townhouse 3 blocks from Luron. And the guest list, briefly visible before Amara slid the paper back with a jolt, included Victor Hale and 3 names tied to the data ethics scandal. And the date was tonight, and the time was after Luron's closing. And the note at the bottom said, "Entrance through service alley, no photos, no staff phones." And Amara felt again that prickling between her shoulders, that map of danger her life had taught her to trust. And she took a breath, looked at Jessica, and said nothing except, "Careful with that stack, it's slipping." And she walked away with a choice coiling in her ribs. She could do nothing, which is what most people do when the wind of other people's power blows cold. Or she could do something small that protected people bigger than her. And the only small thing she could do without breaking rules she respected was to tell Margaret in the simplest terms that a meeting connected to the partner firm was happening close by, after hours, and that if Margaret wished to be somewhere safe and close enough to call for help if she needed it, she could wait in Luron's staff coffee nook that overlooked the alley, a place where Amara sometimes stood at the end of shifts to watch rain beat on the bricks and to count blessings like tips and rent paid and Marcus's stubborn hope. And that is exactly what happened. At 11:30, the dining room emptied. The staff finished their breakdown. Gerald left with a final warning to lock the side door, and in the small coffee nook, the two women sat with paper cups in a quiet that did not feel empty at all, and they watched through the window as cars with dark windows slid into the alley, as men with coats cut like decisions entered the townhouse, as laughter rose and fell like promises, and Margaret signed, "Thank you for sitting with me," and Amara signed back, "You taught me that silence can be full of meaning. This silence is full of choices." Near midnight, a figure separated from the arrivals and crossed the alley toward Luron's side door, and Amara's breath caught until the light from the stairwell fell across his face and she recognized Chloe, who had no reason to be here now and every reason to make trouble. But when Chloe saw Amara through the glass, she lifted both hands in a peace gesture, and when Amara opened the door, Chloe whispered fiercely, "I was asked to cater that townhouse once. They take people's phones. They make jokes about buying regulators. They pay cash for overtime. I don't need to hear everything to know what it is." And then, very unlike the woman who had cut Amara down with small slights all year, Chloe said, "Be smarter than me. Don't think you can walk through a storm without getting wet." And she pressed something into Amara's hand, a business card with a number scribbled on the back, a reporter from a paper that still valued sources more than clicks. And then she was gone and Amara stood blinking at the card. Because help sometimes arrives wearing the face of someone who has hurt you, and that is one of the strangest, truest things about people. By 1 in the morning, the townhouse emptied. The men left in ones and twos, and Victor emerged last with the gray suit watcher at his elbow, the two of them speaking low. And the watcher glanced up at the Luron window with a professional's deadpan, and Amara stepped back into the shadow, and Margaret sat very still. And in the stillness, a decision hardened like cooling glass. Because you can argue market share and speed and growth in 100 languages, but if the foundation is rot, the structure falls, and Margaret had no intention of letting her husband's name fund rot. Not with her silence and not with her money. The day the room. Herd morning came crisp and bright, a contrast to the heaviness that had settled in everyone's shoulders, and in the boardroom where glass met skyline and executive chairs waited like thrones, Margaret arrived with counsel. Not the swaggering kind who mistakes volume for skill, but the quiet kind who knows that paper can be sharper than knives. And Edward arrived tired and ironed, carrying both pride and doubt, and Victor arrived with the smile he wore like armor. And Amara, wearing a plain black dress and a small pendant Marcus had given her for luck, stood at the end of the table as interpreter, invited formally by Margaret so that no one could dismiss her as a curiosity. The agenda looked simple. Approve the Singapore expansion, bless the partner firm, sign the materials disclosures. But agendas are music, and the rests matter as much as the notes. And Margaret used every rest, every pause, every moment when people assume the person who cannot hear will also not lead. And she led, opening with a statement of principles that Amara rendered in steady, clear voice. Our company was built by people who made loud things, engines, networks, fortunes, but its future depends on quiet things, trust, consent, fairness, and any growth built on stolen quiet will collapse. And when she finished, the room, even the ones who came to oppose her, sat straighter, because conviction cleans the air. Then came evidence, not dramatic enough for a movie, but damning enough for a board. Counsel laid out contracts with terms buried in appendices, side letters that committed the company to data flows skirting the edges of law. Payments routed through entities that existed long enough to serve a deal and then dissolve. And with each page, Victor's smile became work. And the gray suit watcher, who now had a name, Arlen Pike, risk consultant, shifted in his chair and took notes that were more like prayers, and Edward's face moved through a map of emotions. Irritation at being blindsided, anger at being manipulated, fear of being wrong, shame at having let his mother carry the moral weight alone, and finally something like resolve. Not yet full, but no longer false, Amara spoke as little as she could, because the work was not to take the stage but to keep the lines true, to give Margaret's precision the sound it deserved. and to make sure that when objections rose, about speed, about competitors, about headlines, Margaret's answers did not get flattened into noise. And she noticed a thing you can only notice if you have lived as a translator between worlds. When people are forced to slow down for understanding, they often end up thinking more clearly, and the room changed under that slowness, becoming for a precious hour a place where truth could fit. At the center of it all, a question stood like a doorway. Did Edward, as CEO, know about the side letters? And if he did not, how would he respond now that he did? And if he did, what would that say? And Edward, whose power had always been to decide faster and harder than anyone else, found himself in unfamiliar territory, the kind where the bravest choice is to admit you missed something important. And at last he said quietly, eyes on the papers, I did not see these letters. I should have. That failure is mine, and I will fix it. And he looked at Victor, and the mask between them cracked, and something old and ugly and familial showed. Rivalry stretched over by shared last names, and Edward said, the expansion is paused effective immediately. The partnership is under review, and an independent audit starts today. And Victor opened his mouth to charm, to deflect, to threaten, but the board chair, who until now had let the family work its drama, raised a hand. Enough. We've heard what we need. And when the vote came, Margaret's position carried. It did not end there, because things like this never end in a single room. They ripple. They find other rooms. They drag unintended people into their wake. And one of those people was Amara, because after the vote, as executives filed out, as council gathered files, Margaret signed, stay a moment. And when the room emptied, Edward stood across from Amara in the light of 10 o'clock sun and said words that sounded like they cost him something. Thank you for treating my mother like she matters, and for forcing me to slow down enough to see what I had missed. And Amara said, anyone with your mother's mind matters in any room. And he gave a quick short nod. Humility not yet his native language, but learning a few phrases. And then he said, we will need an accessibility initiative across the company, not a token, a build it into the bones effort. And I would like you to advise the team, paid, with hours that work for your life, and a pathway to certification if you want it. And Amara felt heat climb into her face. The shy person's blush when the world sees them clearly, and she said, I am not a polished executive. I am a server who learned to listen in more than one language, and Edward said, that is exactly why the initiative might work. As they left the building, Trouble tried one more time to find her, because the gray suit watcher waited near the curb with a small, careful smile. Ms. Thompson, a moment. And Amara stopped because fear should not own the street, and Arlen Pike said, there is a version of this story where you get chewed up by it, and I would prefer you avoid that version. And he handed her a card, said if anyone pressures you, call me. And she looked at the card and then at his face and saw something unexpected. The faint exhaustion of a man who has served too many clients who confuse ruthlessness with competence, and she said, you chose your clients. And he nodded, not always wisely, and he walked away, and the day felt a fraction lighter. What kindness built weeks past, not quietly but productively, because change that sticks is not fireworks, it is carpentry. And together they built Margaret, lending authority and clarity, Edward lending access and infrastructure, and Amara lending the lived intelligence that turned slogans into systems, and from headquarters to warehouses to call centers, training unfurled, not as a lecture that scolds but as a practice that welcomes, teaching managers how to run mixed modality meetings where captions and sign windows and clear agendas made participation real, teaching designers to build forms that spoke in simple language, teaching security teams that consent is not a checkbox but a promise. And Amara insisted on hiring professional interpreters, because her role was to spark and guide, not to be the whole fire, and she took the certification path the company funded, studying late beside Marcus at the kitchen table, their separate textbooks sharing a lamp, their futures braided like the steam from their tea. The restaurant changed too, not in marble and gold but in behavior, because Luron added a basic ASL module to server training, not enough to talk contracts but enough to greet, to offer menus, to answer simple questions with dignity. And Margaret returned often, sometimes with friends from her foundation, sometimes alone with a novel, sometimes with Edward, who now had the good sense to put his phone away when his mother's hands moved, and Chloe, who had once tried to cut Amara down to feel taller, stood at the espresso machine and asked quietly if she might learn a few signs too, and she did, and her shoulders dropped an inch, and her voice softened. And she apologized not with a big speech but with small, consistent good behavior, and that is the only apology that matters. And Gerald, who had never met an innovation he didn't first suspect, took pride in the new comment cards that mentioned kindness as often as cuisine. The corporate cleanup had its harder edges, because people who benefited from shadows do not clap for light, and Victor left the company with statements full of euphemism, and the partner firm's inquiry deepened, and a newspaper that still believed in reporting ran a careful piece about silent stakeholders and how ignoring them costs companies more than money. And nowhere did the article mention Amara's name by design, because she and Margaret had decided the work would be stronger if it stood without a heroine story. But inside rooms that mattered, people knew, and that quiet respect moved opportunities into Amara's orbit the way gravity moves tides. On a soft spring evening, a small event unfolded in Luron's side lounge. Nothing like the glittering galas the restaurant liked to boast about, just a gathering of 10 people from community colleges and nonprofits who worked with deaf students and late deafened adults. And Margaret spoke with her hands and her voice, and Edward spoke briefly with humility that was learning to be less brief, and Amara hosted, making sure plates were where they should be, and that attention moved to the right faces at the right times. And when it was over, when the last guest hugged and left, Margaret pressed a folded letter into Amara's hands, a grant from the Hale Foundation to fund a scholarship in Amara's grandmother's name, for students training in interpreting and inclusive design. And Amara opened her mouth but no words came, and instead her hands rose. "Thank you," and Margaret's hands answered, "Thank you for seeing me first, before the money, before the name, and for teaching my son how to listen." The final scene did not happen under chandeliers but on a sunny bench outside a small campus building, where Marcus would graduate in a month. The kind of bench where someone once kissed for the first time and someone else cried after an exam. A bench with the honest history of ordinary joy. And Amara sat with a paper cup and looked at the students walking past, loud with youth and quiet with worry. And Edward approached in weekend clothes that made him look almost like a person who could stand in a grocery store line without being recognized. And he handed her a folder, inside a full-time offer to lead the accessibility and trust pilot, with pay that meant the apartment would no longer be a stretch, and the future would no longer be a cliff. And she read it and laughed a little because her hands shook. And she said, "I will accept with 2 conditions. First, the program hires from the communities it serves. Second, the company publishes an annual, honest trust report that a 19-year-old can read." And Edward grinned, not his sharp grin but something younger. Done, and they shook hands, and a breeze moved the spring leaves like applause. That night, back at the apartment, Amara stood at the small kitchen counter with Marcus, chopping onions and laughing at tears that were not from vegetables, and she told him everything. And he lifted her in a spinning hug that made their spoons clatter. And on the fridge a new paper joined the old magnets, the first page of the scholarship announcement bearing their grandmother's name, neat and strong, and Amara touched the paper with her fingertips, as if it were a cheek, and she whispered into the room the truth that had remade her days. That kindness is not soft, it is a backbone, that listening is not passive, it is a skill, that learning someone's language, voice or sign or silence is not a trick, it is a promise. And that a shy waitress can change a billion-dollar room without raising her volume. Only her hands, and somewhere across town, in a different room where people still spoke too loudly about winning, a gray suit consultant looked at a list of clients and drew a line through a name. And a former cousin set down a glass and began to learn what it cost to mistake cleverness for character. And a restaurant that once treated invisibility like a requirement learned to see. And a company that had confused speed with virtue remembered how to walk at the pace of trust. And a mother who had been asked too long to sit quiet sat at the center again, not as a symbol but as a mind. And a daughter of a grandmother who taught that silence is full of detail, moved through her life with her hands ready. Because when kindness speaks, it does not whisper, it signs.